Morning they let me out, it was raining. Not a dramatic storm, just that flat gray Portland drizzle that soaks through your jacket before you even realize it's happening. I stood outside the Inverness Jail Processing Center with a paper bag containing my watch, my wallet, and the belt they'd taken from me 14 months ago. I didn't have a car waiting. I didn't call anyone. I just stood there in the rain for a few minutes, breathing air that didn't smell like industrial cleaner and other men's regret. 14 months. That's how long my son and his wife managed to keep me away from everything I'd spent 40 years building. I want to be careful here, because when I tell this story, people assume I'm a bitter old man looking for sympathy. Maybe I am, but I also think there's something in what happened to me that's worth understanding, because I made every mistake a trusting father can make, and I made them with my eyes open. My name is not important. What's important is that I was 63 years old. I had a plumbing and HVAC supply business I'd started out of my garage in Beaverton, Oregon in 1987, and by the time my son Nathan turned 35, the company was doing just under $4 million a year in revenue. Not tech money, not Wall Street money, but solid, honest Pacific Northwest money built on handshakes and showing up on time. Nathan was my only child. His mother passed when he was 17, pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end, and after that it was just the two of us. I didn't date much. I worked. I coached his baseball team until he quit to play guitar in a band that lasted about 8 months. I helped him move into 4 different apartments. I flew to Austin when he called me at midnight saying he'd made a mistake moving there, and I drove a U-Haul back to Portland with him sleeping the whole way. We were close. I believed we were close. He met Courtney at a wedding in 2018. She was sharp, quick with a laugh, and within 6 months she had moved into his place in Southeast Portland. I liked her well enough at first. She worked in commercial real estate, and she knew how to talk. But there was something about the way she looked at my business, at the warehouse on Tualatin Sherwood Road, at the fleet accounts, at the supplier relationships I'd built over 4 decades, that I can only describe as calculating, like she was doing math in her head that I couldn't see. In the spring of 2020, when everything was shutting down, and I was genuinely scared about what the pandemic would do to a business that depended on contractors being able to work, Nathan came to me with a proposal. He and Courtney wanted to help. He'd been working in the business part-time for 2 years, mostly logistics, some customer relations, and Courtney had experience structuring commercial deals. They wanted to formalize their roles, take on more responsibility, free me up to think about retirement. I should have said no. Instead, I said yes, and I added Courtney's name to the business accounts. I gave her signatory authority over our operating account, our supplier credit line, and a reserve fund I kept specifically for payroll emergencies. I did it because I loved my son, and I trusted that loving him meant trusting the person he loved. I told myself it was practical. I told myself I was being a good father by letting him grow into the business. What I didn't know was that by the following January, Courtney had opened 2 LLCs in Delaware, shell companies with names that looked, at a glance, like they could be vendors we actually used. One was called Pacific Rim Supply Partners. The other was called Northwest HVAC Wholesale Group. If you were skimming a bank statement, you might not look twice. Over 11 months, she routed $460,000 out of my company and into those 2 entities, and from there into a joint account she and Nathan held in a credit union in Vancouver, Washington, across the river, different state, harder to trace. I didn't notice. That's the part that still keeps me up at night. I didn't notice for almost a year. What I noticed was that our cash position was softer than it should have been given our revenue. I noticed that 2 of our long-term suppliers had quietly shifted us from net 30 to payment in advance without any conversation. I noticed that my bookkeeper, a woman named Patricia who had been with me for 19 years, seemed nervous in a way I couldn't quite name. When I asked her directly, she said everything was fine. I found out later that Courtney had told her that I was aware of the new payment structures and had approved them personally. Patricia believed her. In October of 2021, I hired an outside accountant to do a full review. His name was Dwight, and he was thorough in the way that only accountants who have seen real fraud are thorough. It took him 3 weeks. When he called me to come into his office, he closed the door before he started talking. He walked me through it page by page. The shell companies, the wire transfers, the timing of the transactions, always mid-month, always under the threshold that would trigger automatic review. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. I sat in that chair and felt something I can only describe as a slow collapse. Not anger, not yet. Just the sensation of something structural giving way inside my chest. I called Nathan that night. I didn't tell him what I knew. I just asked if we could have dinner that week. Said I wanted to talk through some financial stuff. He said, sure, Thursday works. He never showed up Thursday. Instead, at 6:30 that evening, 2 detectives from the Washington County Sheriff's Office knocked on my door. I thought they were coming about Courtney. I thought I was about to find out that my son's wife was being arrested and my son was somehow involved and this was going to be the worst year of our lives. But at least the truth was coming out. They arrested me. The charges were embezzlement and wire fraud. My own company. Nearly $500,000. The detectives were professional and not unkind, but they put handcuffs on me in my own kitchen, and as they walked me out to the patrol car, I could see my neighbor across the street, standing in her driveway, watching. I found out the next morning, sitting in a jail cell waiting for my arraignment, that Nathan and Courtney had gone to the authorities themselves. They had filed a complaint. They had provided documentation, bank records, emails, what turned out to be selectively edited communications that made it appear that I had been directing Courtney to move funds as part of a scheme I had orchestrated. They had presented themselves as employees who had discovered their employer stealing from his own business and didn't know what else to do. The bail was set at $250,000. I didn't have that liquid. I had a business that was bleeding, an accountant who had just found evidence of fraud committed by my daughter-in-law, and a son who had apparently been planning this long enough to build a paper trail pointing directly at me. My attorney, a woman named Helen, who I found through a referral from a client, told me not to panic. She also told me the evidence against me, on its face, looked significant. The emails were the most damaging. There were dozens of them, apparently from my account, referencing the payment structures, referencing the LLCs, asking Courtney to confirm transfers had cleared. I had not written any of those emails. I told Helen that. She believed me. She also told me that proving I hadn't written them would require a level of digital forensic work that cost money I wasn't sure I had access to, given that my business accounts were now frozen as part of the investigation. I spent 11 days in the Inverness facility before a bail arrangement was made. One of my oldest clients, a man I'd done business with since 1994, who I will not name here because he has never asked for any recognition, put up collateral against a bail bond. He did it without me asking. He'd heard what happened and he called Helen directly. Those 11 days with her own education. I am 63 years old and I am not a small man, and I'd spent 4 decades in a business where you learn to read people quickly. But nothing in that experience prepared me for what it feels like to be in a place where your history means nothing and your word means nothing, and every hour is exactly like the hour before it. I met a man in there named Curtis. He was 58, had been a long-haul trucker until a cargo dispute turned into a fraud allegation, turned into his life coming apart at the seams. He had a quiet way of explaining the rhythms of the place, when to be alert, when it was okay to keep your head down, which guards were fair, and which ones were looking for reasons. I don't know what I would have done without that orientation. We played cards in the common room and he talked about his daughter in Spokane, who sent him letters every week. I talked about my son. Curtis listened without saying anything for a long time and then said, "Sometimes it's the ones closest to us that know exactly where to aim." I thought about that a lot in the 14 months that followed. The trial was scheduled for the following September. In the meantime, Helen worked with a digital forensic specialist she'd used before, a man named Vincent who operated out of a small office in Tigard and looked like a college professor but apparently had testified as an expert witness in more than 40 federal cases. His fees were significant. I paid them by taking out a second mortgage on the house I'd owned since 1998. I want you to understand that decision. I mortgaged the house where I'd raised my son, the house where his mother and I had brought him home from the hospital, in order to prove that my son had helped his wife steal from me and frame me for it. Vincent found what he needed in 6 weeks. The emails that have been provided to investigators as evidence against me have metadata inconsistencies. The timestamps didn't align with the server logs from my email provider. More significantly, 3 of the emails that were supposedly sent from my account had been sent from an IP address that traced back to a coffee shop in the Pearl District of Portland, a neighborhood I had no regular reason to visit and no record of visiting on those dates. My phone's location data, pulled from my carrier, placed me at my warehouse on 2 of the 3 dates in question. The third date was a Sunday. I had been at a home improvement store in Tigard buying supplies for a bathroom remodel. The credit card transaction and the store's security camera footage confirmed it. Helen brought this to the prosecution in June. They took 8 weeks to respond, which is its own kind of answer. In August, 11 months after my arrest, the charges against me were dropped. Nathan and Courtney were arrested 3 days later. The charges against them included wire fraud, identity fraud, and theft in the first degree. Courtney faced additional charges related to the structuring of the shell companies. I was not there when they were arrested. I found out from Helen, who called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at the warehouse doing inventory, something I'd started doing partly to keep busy and partly because the business had suffered badly during the investigation and I needed to understand exactly where we stood. I sat down on a pallet of copper fittings and stayed there for a while after she hung up. There was no one to call. My son was being processed into the same facility I'd spent 11 days and 14 months earlier. His wife was beside him. Whatever I felt in that moment, and I felt many things, none of them simple, I kept it to myself. What I want to tell you about is the 6 weeks before the charges against Nathan and Courtney were dropped, because that's the part of this story that I think matters most, and it's the part nobody talks about when they talk about cases like mine. I had a granddaughter. Nathan and Courtney had a daughter, Amelia, who was 4 years old at the time of my arrest and turned 5 while I was fighting my case. She had my wife's eyes, the same particular shade of gray-green that I'd fallen in love with in 1979 and that I had not expected to see again in anyone's face. Courtney's parents, who lived in Medford, had been taking care of Amelia since the investigation began, and they had made clear, through Nathan and then through their own attorney, that they did not want me to have contact with her. I understood their position. From their perspective, I was a man who had stolen from a family business and put their daughter and son-in-law in a difficult position. They were protecting their granddaughter. I cannot fault them for that even now. But the day the charges against me were dropped, before the news reached them, I drove to Medford. It's a 4-hour drive through the Cascades, and I drove it alone, listening to a radio station out of Eugene that played classic country until the signal faded somewhere past Roseburg, and then I just drove in silence. Courtney's mother answered the door. Her name is Pamela, and she is a small woman who had always been polite to me in the years I'd known her, which had not been many. She looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. I told her that the charges had been dropped. I told her that evidence had been found that cleared me completely. I told her that Nathan and Courtney would likely be arrested within the next few days, and that I wanted her to hear it from me and not from the news, and that whatever happened next, Amelia should not be in a position where she was confused about who loved her. Pamela started crying. Not a small cry. The kind of crying that's been stored up for a long time. She stepped back from the door, and I went inside, and we sat at her kitchen table while she tried to absorb what I was telling her. Amelia was in the backyard with Pamela's husband, Warren. He came in a few minutes later, heard what I'd told Pamela, and sat down heavily in a chair at the other end of the table. He's a retired civil engineer, a quiet man, and he just looked at the tablecloth for a long time. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." I told him he didn't. He said he did. We didn't argue about it. Amelia came inside looking for a snack, stopped when she saw a stranger at the table, and stared at me with those gray-green eyes. "This is your grandpa," Pamela said. "Your daddy's daddy." Amelia looked at me very seriously for a moment. Then she said, "Do you like grilled cheese?" I told her it was one of my favorites. We had lunch. I drove home. The trial for Nathan and Courtney began the following spring. I testified. I sat in the witness stand in a courtroom in downtown Portland, and I answered questions for 4 hours, and during most of that time I did not look at my son, who was seated at the defense table in a suit I did not recognize. When I did look at him, near the end of my testimony, he was looking down at the table. Nathan was sentenced to 4 years. Courtney received 6, with the additional charges related to the fraud scheme. Their attorneys are appealing, which I'm told could take years and will probably change nothing. I did, eventually, pursue a civil claim against them. Helen referred me to another attorney who specialized in civil fraud cases. The judgment I received will take years to collect, if I collect it at all, given that most of the stolen funds had been spent. But the judgment exists, and it establishes in legal record what happened to me, and that matters to me in a way I can't fully explain. About the wrongful arrest, I looked into whether I had grounds to take action against the county. Helen was honest with me. Cases against law enforcement for investigating a complaint that turned out to be fraudulent are difficult. The detectives acted on evidence that was presented to them as legitimate. The system failed me, but not in a way that creates easy legal remedy. I chose to spend my energy on the business rather than on litigation. I might not win. The business recovered, not fully. We lost 2 major fleet accounts during the investigation, and I've only won back one of them. Patricia, my bookkeeper, stayed. She apologized to me the day I returned to the office, and I told her there was nothing to apologize for, because there wasn't. She had been lied to by people she trusted. That's not a moral failing. That's being human. Curtis, the man I met during my 11 days in Inverness, was convicted in his own case and served 18 months. He was released about 8 months after I was. I found out through a contact I'd made during my case. I drove out to where he was staying, a transitional housing facility in Gresham, and brought him a bag of groceries and the name of a trucking company in Troutdale that I knew was hiring. I don't know if he followed up, but I made the call for him. The apology I received from the court was a letter, formal language, no admission of systemic fault, an acknowledgement that the charges had been dismissed based on exculpatory evidence. I read it twice and put it in a filing cabinet. I'm not interested in apologies from institutions. What I was interested in was getting back to work. I see Amelia twice a month now. Pamela and Warren bring her up from Medford or I drive down. She has started calling me Pop Pop, which was not a name I chose and which I find, against all my expectations, exactly right. She is 6 years old, and she is opinionated about breakfast foods and serious about her stuffed animal collection and completely unaware of the specific mechanics of how her parents ended up where they are. I don't intend to explain it to her for a long time. Last month, she asked me if her daddy was coming home soon. I told her that her daddy had made some mistakes and that there were consequences for mistakes, and that none of it had anything to do with how much her daddy loved her or how much she was loved by the people in her life right now. She thought about this for a moment and then said, "Like when I broke Grandma's lamp and couldn't watch TV for a week?" I said yes, exactly like that. She seemed satisfied with that answer. Kids often are when you tell them the truth in terms they can hold. I am 64 years old now. I get up at 5:15 every morning. I drive to the warehouse. I make coffee in the break room, and I go through the day's orders before anyone else arrives. I have spent 40 years in this business, and I intend to spend more. The man who came out of that processing center in the rain 14 months after he went in is the same man who built this company from nothing, and the same man who raised a son who, despite everything, I still love in a way that has no bottom. I just don't trust him anymore. And I've come to understand that those two things can exist at the same time. Love without trust, grief without closure. A life that is quieter and smaller than the one I expected, and somehow still worth getting up for every morning at 5:15. Some days that feels like a loss. Most days it feels like enough. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually went wrong, not the legal mechanics. I understand those now better than I ever wanted to. I mean the deeper thing, the first wrong turn. And I keep coming back to the same moment. The afternoon I added Courtney's name to the operating accounts. Not because she'd earned it. Not because there was any business reason that couldn't have been handled another way. But because I loved my son, and I thought loving him meant extending that same unconditional trust to whoever he chose to love. That's where the chain of consequences started. Not with their greed. That was already there, waiting. It started with my decision to hand over something I'd built over 40 years based on nothing more than family feeling. I don't say that to punish myself. I say it because I think a lot of people make that same mistake, and they make it because they believe that trust is something you give as a gift, rather than something that gets built over time through demonstrated character. Nathan and Courtney understood how I thought. They knew I valued loyalty above almost everything else, and they used that knowledge precisely and deliberately. That's not bad luck. That's a specific kind of intelligence applied toward a specific kind of harm. What saved me wasn't luck either. It was Dwight asking the right questions when I was willing to hear the answers. It was Helen knowing that metadata doesn't lie the way people do. It was Vincent, who spent 6 weeks in a small office in Tigard pulling apart digital threads until the truth was sitting on a table where a prosecutor couldn't ignore it. Every one of those people brought something sharp and clear to a situation designed to be muddy. I think about that when I hear people say that intelligence is just about being book smart. Real intelligence, the kind that matters when your life is coming apart, is about seeing clearly when everything around you is designed to make you see wrong. And then there's the question of how you survive it. 14 months, a second mortgage on the house where I raised my son, a business bleeding accounts while I was unable to defend it, Patricia crying at her desk the day I came back. There were mornings in that facility when I genuinely did not know what I was going to return to, or whether returning to anything was possible. What kept me functional wasn't hope in any abstract sense. It was stubbornness. It was a refusal to accept that the story ended there, in a corrections facility in Portland with a paper bag and a belt and nothing else. That's not courage. I don't think what I did was courageous. It was just a decision, made repeatedly, to stay in the fight one more day. Amelia asked me last month if I was sad sometimes. I told her yes. She said, "Me too. But then it gets better." 6 years old. She already understands the thing it took me 64 years to really believe, that consequences are real, that they run in both directions, and that the people who build things honestly and refuse to stop are the ones who still have something standing when the smoke clears. I think about Curtis in that jail common room, saying that the people closest to us know exactly where to aim. He was right. But here's what he didn't say, and what I've figured out since. They also know exactly what can't be taken from you, if you're determined enough to hold on to it. The warehouse is still there, the copper fittings, the 5:15 alarm, the drive-in while Portland is still dark. That's mine. It always was.